Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2023. This is a BookTube event that was created by Vin at Revenant Reads a few years ago. It's now in its third year. It's assembled a crew of booktubers to talk about Star Trek all summer long, and we're running out of summer here in Boston. And I've been neglectful of BookTube. I made a bunch of videos. I kind of wanted my co-host to catch up, and also I've had lots of distractions that are now over. So I thought I'd get back to BookTrek today, not with talking about a specific book, but with a tag. if I make a tag on Monday, maybe it'll be in time for some people to do it on Tuesday. So we're going to do the Deep Space Nine BookTrek tag. There were in the what is classically called the Roddenberry era. It should be called the Braga era as well. But in the Roddenberry era, there was the original series and all of the movies that came from it. There was Star Trek: The Next Generation. There was Star Trek: Deep Space Nine. That, as we've mentioned before on this channel, took a lot of risks that no other Star Trek show had taken or has taken since. And then there was Star Trek Voyager, then Star Trek Enterprise, and then that era came to an end. And now we have an equal number of new Trek shows that bear little resemblance to that old era, even though some actors cross over. And one of the changes that Deep Space Nine did was to get rid of the moving starship. It was set on a space station named Deep Space Nine. But one of the classic ways that the classic Star Trek things that it did was a great central cast. Varied great central cast. True, they weren't bridge officers on a starship, but that allowed for more amplitude, not less. So why don't we go through those characters? I'll meander just a bit, and we'll ask a few nosy questions. So we'll start, of course, with Captain Sisko. Captain Benjamin Sisko was the commander of Deep Space Nine. Right from the beginning, a daring choice in a whole bunch of different ways. Not only is Avery Brooks the actor who plays him, the Black Man, but also in the first episode of Deep Space Nine, his command of Deep Space Nine is conveyed upon him by Captain Jean-Luc Picard of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And Captain Sisko Commander Sisko hates Picard. Because when Picard was overcome, when he was taken over by the Borg, he led an assault on Starfleet that cost many, many, many hundreds of lives, including Benjamin Sisko's wife, the mother of his son. So that was another thing that was pretty rare in Star Trek up until that point, to have Star Trek have one Star Trek officer viscerally hate another Star Trek officer. Picard doesn't feel anything for Sisko, but in their one scene together, Sisko is seething with hatred for Picard. But there's also another element to Benjamin Sisko, which is that, in reasons that are not fully explored in the show, it's an element that I wish Deep Space Nine had done a better job exploring it. Deep Space Nine orbits the planet Bajor, a beautiful, largely civilian, somewhat sub-tech planet that is near, very, very near, within visual sight of a stable wormhole, a quantum tunnel that leads you from the Alpha Quadrant, from the area of Bajor and Deep Space Nine, straight to the Gamma Quadrant with no traveling in between. It would take you decades otherwise to make a trip, even at high warp. So the wormhole is important. It plays a huge part in the show, and it is, of course, a traffic for commerce, and later on in the show becomes a traffic for war. But it's been there forever. It's been there for a long, long time. The Bajoran people worship it. They've seen it up in their sky, opening and closing periodically, for the whole of their civilization. They believe that the wormhole is occupied by gods that live inside the wormhole and presumably will overlook it, and you go into their safekeeping when you travel through it. And they also believe that the wormhole aliens, the prophets as they call them, regularly have emissaries, and they can pick anybody they want. They can pick it doesn't have to be a Bajoran. And in the context of Deep Space Nine, the Bajorans believe that Benjamin Sisko is the current emissary. But we don't ever learn really how deep that goes, or how widespread that is, or what it entails. Is it a kind of messiah, or is it closer to a prophet in the Old Testament? In other words, what I'm asking is a question that several Deep Space Nine fans actually did ask and never got a definitive answer. Does do the Bajorans who work on Deep Space Nine alongside Benjamin Sisko, even in his chain of command, do they also worship him? Do they have a little icon of him in their quarters? We don't ever get that answer. But question number one is, Captain Sisko, the emissary, are you religious yourself? Have you ever been? What kind of a role does religion play in your life? And for me, the role is entirely, for want of a better word, ceremonial. Religion as a cultural force is enormously powerful, always has been enormously powerful. It's enormously varied. Of course, the religion I know best is Christianity. And it has, all religions have created not just huge social ripples, but enormous artistic footprints that I think are fascinating to study. Absolutely fascinating. Not just their primary and secondary documents, although that's my natural focus, but also everything else. Every mosque, every cathedral, every temple, that sort of thing. So in that sense, religion plays a big role in my life and always has. In that sense, it would be unthinkable for me to think of a world without that. In the other sense of being religious, in the sense not so much of what role does it play in my life, but have I ever actually had personal faith? No, I have not. I have never had any kind of personal faith. And the answer for that is very straightforward. It's that I know how limited this is. There are no other species that do this, just the one. Now, religions from time immemorial, including 10,000 years before there was a Christianity, 11,000 years before there was an Islam, thousands and thousands and thousands of years before there were the modern religions of today, religions have always carved out an exception for why that would be so. They're actually pretty quick to do it because I think they realize what an Achilles heel it is. If it's anything natural, if it's anything real, then other species might do it. They wouldn't be the same gods, but they would definitely do it. And they don't. Only humans do it. I knew that long before I knew anything about the world or about language or history or religion itself, because I spent a lot of time with non-human animals. I got to know what they do and don't do. And then when I was dragged kicking and screaming to Sunday service or out into the human world, I saw all the things they don't do that humans do. I don't know if that objection makes any sense to anyone else. To me, it seems like an absolute deal breaker, an absolute giant slayer if that is true. And that is true. But also, there's the fact that there is no evidence for any of it at all. Not ever. Not going all of those 10,000 years back. There's no evidence that any of it is true. I'm not a Vulcan. I'm not saying that I rule my life entirely by evidence. I'm not saying that I gauge my reactions to things based on some sort of caliper measurement. But if someone is making an extraordinary claim to me, then I want them to at least indicate that it might be true, at least point me in that direction. If they're going to make an extraordinary claim and they're going to tell me that they want to write legislation that's going to rule what I do based on that claim, and that they want me to feel that claim, you had better be able to prove it to me. And you can't. That is the problem of divine hiddenness. There is no evidence for any of this, as apologists have been saying for thousands of years. Thousands of years ago, at risk to their very life, now you're largely free to do it. Unless you live in an Islamic country, you're largely free to do it, or the American Deep South. As they've been saying for thousands of years, the universe and the world and life and all living things looks exactly like it would if there were no gods and goddesses at all. It looks exactly like that. So when you say there are gods and goddesses, well, it's entirely on you to tell that to me. And no one can. There are the arguments that faith apologists have been making forever are so bad. It's only a tiny handful of them, and they're so bad that a child could walk through them. It's ultimately not a question of fact, so it's a question of some inner call. I definitely don't have that call, so it doesn't play any kind of. I am not religious in any way. Question number 2, to get off the hot topic. Let's see if we will. A lot of these questions are troublemaking. So, Major Kira. Major Kira is a Bajoran. She was a freedom fighter, a guerrilla warrior against the occupation of her planet by a race called the Cardassians, who owned Deep Space Nine before they built it. It was a space station of theirs originally called Tarak Noor. They recognized the value of the wormhole. They wanted to pillage the natural resources of Bajor, and they committed a ruthless military occupation of the planet. And Major Kira, when she was just a child, she was just Kira Nerys, was part of a resistance cell, routinely had to go out and kill the Cardassians, blow up munitions dumps, all that sort of thing, and has risen to be Benjamin Sisko's second in command. Not a member of Starfleet. It was Starfleet and the Federation viewed it as very important that a Bajoran have some major say in the station that's orbiting their planet once the Federation makes the Cardassians leave. Again, an untold story that I wish had been better plumbed as to how Kira Nerys got that job instead of anybody else. Instead of anybody, for instance, older. But Major Kira, the former resistance fighter, have you ever been in any kind of combat, armed or unarmed? So the armed part would be, have you served in a military on the front lines? Have you actually had to have extensive firearms drilling? I have never fired a firearm. I have been in lots of unarmed combat. Lots. When you travel as much as I have and you go to places that are off the map, into little known places, and maybe you have a crowd of dogs, and maybe you don't like to take crap from people, it's entirely possible that you will run into trouble. The modern travel industry is almost single-mindedly designed to shepherd you away from that part of the world. But that part of the world exists. And I'm not talking about exotic either. You can encounter that part of the world if you thru-hike the Appalachian Trail. You will almost certainly encounter a raging a-hole. And maybe someone wants to get violent. You never know. Small town Wyoming, small town Montana. I've had it happen in America as much as I've had it happen anywhere else. But yes, when I was infinitely younger, it was often necessary for me to be in unarmed combat. I had a few things in my favor back then. This is to say nothing of the fact that all of those dogs who were sleeping under the porch of the bar, or who were sleeping in the shade of the hotel or whatever, that you don't pay any attention to, except maybe to do a half-hearted kick in their direction. Well, they all have sharp teeth, and they all work for me. So aside from that, I also had other advantages. I know how the human body works. I know everything about where you are, where everything is in your body. I know exactly what to hit first. In other words, as a friend of mine used to put it, I know exactly what to hit first so that I don't need to hit anything second. I know exactly where to inflict pain. And that's if I'm not angry. That will only work if you're not. For me, that will only work if you're not angry. When I'm angry, all that gets clouded over. There's still other things. When I was younger, I was a little stronger and a lot faster than I looked, and I don't feel any pain. And I had 15 years of kendo, so this is the only reason I'm here now is because I was to a limited degree able to handle myself in such situations. I would love to know about you. These are all nosy personal questions. It was my experience, both in the outside world and in America, it has been my experience that most people, even loudmouth belligerents, don't actually want to fight. Because once a fight starts, it's totally unpredictable what will happen, and that causes a moment of fear. And for better or worse, I was not raised. That causes a moment of fear that is generated by the human ability to imagine the future. Humans do this in all cases. They torture themselves all day long by imagining the future. But one way that it applies in fighting is that they imagine, well, I could get really hurt, or this person could gouge an eye out, or something like that. And I was raised and socialized by a species that does not kid around when it's time to fight, and they don't think that way at all. So I don't either. So often I have had it happen that I would, and some stranger would get right to the precipice of violence, and they would somehow read that in me. They would somehow read that I am not at all thinking about what's going to happen in the next minute, and therefore I'm ready. I'm not going to back down. So if you insist on that, well, you're the only one who's worrying about that moment. I often found that saved me from any kind of actual violence, which is great because I'm a peaceful soul. Anyway, I want to know about you. Then question number 3, Chief Engineer O'Brien, Keiko's husband. In Deep Space Nine, a character from Star Trek The Next Generation, Miles O'Brien, is transferred to Deep Space Nine as their chief engineer. And he has a wife. He has a wife, you do. Keiko is his wife. And our question is, have you ever had, or do you currently have, a nagging wife? If so, how often do you contemplate killing her and making it look like an accident? And this would only be the door open to endless number of Deb stories from me. But thankfully, the old ball and chain is currently a couple of states to the north. So I don't have any problems along those lines now. But I'd love to hear about you. Feel free to vent about the old ball and chain. Question number 4 is Constable Odo, the shapeshifter. Again, an element of Deep Space Nine that for years I thought, you're not just going to have this sitting here without examining it. Then fortunately the show does examine the hell out of shapeshifters, and Odo in particular. But he is a gelatinous being who can assume a humanoid form and all sorts of other forms. He doesn't know much about himself at the beginning of the show, and he never quite learns how to command his powers completely. Not in his right mind. Which I guess makes sense, because he'd be all-powerful if he did. He certainly doesn't ever show any of the degree of fine-tuned control over his shapeshifting that the other shapeshifters show once we finally meet them. I mentioned that the wormhole eventually in the course of the show becomes an avenue for troops to come through the wormhole to attack the Federation. And those troops are governed by shapeshifters. They're governed by Odo's own people. And there, the showrunners definitely lean into that whole thing and do a wonderful job at it. So I can't claim that he is totally unexplored. And the question here is, do you shapeshift in your daily life? Here, I'm not talking about you changing into a werebunny or whatever. I'm talking about, are you completely different from moment to moment? Are you very different in different settings? So much that those of us on BookTube would be surprised. Would say, okay, that's a side of you that I never see. Now, keep in mind, in this question, I'm not asking you to tell us what that side is. I know that a lot of you have lives outside of BookTube that are not like the persona that you have on BookTube. And I have never said that that was in and of itself an evil thing unless you're lying about it. There's a difference between lying about who you are and simply having discretion like an adult. For myself, I don't know. It's possible that this question is best asked to people who know you rather than to you, but I don't think I do shapeshift anymore. Once upon a time, I did in a couple of ways. I'm not sure that a lot of you now in 2023, science fiction territory, I'm not sure that a lot of you now would readily recognize the Steve who did all of that traveling. Some aspects of it, but maybe not all, maybe not most. But now, I don't know. I've talked to a lot of people. I've had a lot of people here as guests, just had a guest. And the impression I get is that I don't think you would be much surprised by spending time with me. I think spending time with me now is pretty much the same as spending time with me here in these videos. Maybe some levels of tedium that aren't exposed on this channel, but most of it not. But I'm wondering about you. Do you have a high-stress job where you're a completely different person than the person you are on channel? Are you different with your kids as a parent than you are now, than you are on camera? Are there or have there been aspects of your life that would make you unrecognizable to those of us who know you only parasocially? Then question number 5 is Science Officer Jadzia Dax, centuries old. We meet Jadzia Dax, the young, beautiful science officer on board Deep Space Nine, and she herself is in her late 20s, early 30s, but she is a Trill, and some members of the Trill people accept a symbiont, a slug about the size of a loaf of bread that's alive, it's sentient, and the symbionts are virtually immortal. They live for centuries. The ordinary people from Trill don't. They live a normal human lifespan. But if you're joined with a Trill, you have access to their personality and all of their memories. So you've got an immortal being lodged inside a mortal body. A fascinating subject that originated earlier in Deep Space, in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and is really well done, really well explored in some episodes of Deep Space Nine. So Jadzia Dax is young and modern, but the Dax symbiont has had many identities before it was Jadzia, if that makes any sense. It's been in many Trill bodies before, and one of its earlier identities was a roistering, larger-than-life diplomat called Curzon Dax, who was an old friend and a mentor of Benjamin Sisko when he was a much younger man. Now, all of a sudden, through happenstance, his science officer was once Curzon Dax, to the point where they're intimately good friends. There's a wonderful moment early on in the show where they wonder if maybe they should be romantically attached to each other, and the minute they think about it, they both start laughing. It's not going to happen. Absolutely not. But, for instance, I mean, they know each other really, really well, and one of the ways is something that is an enormous breach of proper etiquette, of proper Starfleet etiquette, an enormous breach in both directions that no one else on the station can get away with. She calls him Benjamin. Even in high-stakes situations when they're on the bridge together, she calls the captain Benjamin. And he calls her, this tall, statuesquely beautiful woman, he calls her old man. All throughout the show, he calls her old man. So the show does it really, really well. What kind of an intrusive question do I come up with for Jadzia Dax? Oh, right. What's your relationship with science? Have you studied it? How much of a part does it play in your life? I have not studied it myself, except amateurly. I couldn't get out of academic science classes fast enough, and I bungled lots of them because they involve math. But I find it endlessly fascinating to study in an amateur way. I subscribe to a whole bunch of science YouTube channels. I watch every word they do. I think it's fascinating. The things that it shows me, the stories that it tells, not so much the math that makes it go. But as far as the role that it plays in my life, good Lord, what could it play a bigger role in my life? I could not do any work. I could not do any of my jobs if it weren't for the science of the technology that I'm using right now to talk to you. Don't understand any of it. I've watched a million YouTube teardown videos where somebody opens up a laptop computer and takes you through everything that's going on inside. It's mind-bogglingly complex and incredibly interesting. There are a couple of channels that do that really well. But I don't understand it. I don't begin to understand it. But I couldn't do anything without it. I'm not talking just work, although all of my work is online. I don't go to any place to earn a living. I don't punch any kind of a time clock, but also a whole bunch of my play. Now that I am back in circulation, I think I will probably ease back into circulation, but now that I'm back in circulation on BookTube, I realize it underscores all the more. I couldn't do this whole wonderful thing without technology, without science. This whole wonderful thing, not just a question of talking to my imaginary BookTube friends, but getting things in the mail and occasionally having guests, making actual friends. It was technology, it was science that did all of that. There's a huge part of my life that doesn't involve it at all. There's a huge part of my life that doesn't involve it at all, including every night at midnight, or if I have a guest over 3:30, if every night at midnight, I intentionally go away from all technology except for printed books. This is, the oldest technology, but otherwise it plays a huge role in my life, just huge. Ordering food, for instance, that's done technologically. I don't pick up the phone for that. But anyway, let's see here. We should hurry on because I hear the landscapers and this might become inaudible. Number 6, Jake Sisko, the commander's son. Were you annoying as a kid yourself? And if you have kids, on a scale of 8 to 10, how annoying are they? Of course, I have no kids. Deb used to pop them out 8 at a time, but we left them at the dump to fend for themselves, figuring that the strongest ones would survive. No, the closest I have to children would be an endless stream of dogs, but I am not like a lot of dog owners. I would say the majority of dog owners. I don't think of them as children once they're adults. They're just as smart as I am. So when they're puppies, yes, then I think of them as children, but I don't, unless they stay simple and stupid, which I don't like my dogs to do, then I don't think of them as children anymore, even though I reflexively refer to them as the baby. Anyway, question number 7, Lieutenant Worf, Chief of Security, another crossover from Star Trek The Next Generation, like Miles O'Brien, but Worf is, of course, one of the most popular characters in all of Star Trek. So his crossover to Deep Space Nine brought a flock of new viewers to the show, and the writers, the showrunners, did Worf perfectly. Oh my God, he was really well done in The Next Generation. He's even better done in Deep Space Nine. Was there ever a time when you were embarrassed by your parents? Referring to a great Star Trek The Next Generation episode where we meet the human couple that raised the fully Klingon boy, Worf, when he was on Earth. complicated circumstances that we can get to at some Klingon tag, Worf was raised not on Kronos, the Klingon homeworld, but by two humans, loving, doting humans. And in the episode where we meet these parents, he's a little embarrassed by them. They are a little much. They are the way of older parents, enthusing and being awkward. Was there ever a time when you were embarrassed by your parents? What role do they play in your life, if any? There was never a time when I was embarrassed by my parents. I didn't know my father. But there was never a time in my life when I was embarrassed by me Saint Ma. All sorts of other things. Annoyance, irritation, lots and lots of really fun ribbing, but not embarrassment. And the oddest thing is that although she's been gone for a long time, she does play a role in my life. I don't think that's possible to avoid when your parent ends up being a real close friend of yours. There was a 10-year period where the best human friend I had on Earth was my mother. That's the person who'd known me the longest. And that was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. It was free. We had been apart for a long time. She knew that I had seen a lot that she didn't know about. So we came together as individuals, as adults, in a circumstance where either one of us could have walked away and found that that was the last thing we wanted to do. We wanted to crack wise with each other and have fun and watch things on TV, just spend time talking. And that, I think when you do that, that sticks with you. That person is going to be around even when they're gone. I think that's the nature of a good, solid relationship, is that it doesn't ever actually end. At least that's the way I feel. Maybe I'm just consoling myself, but I enjoy it. I enjoy her company still. I enjoy wondering what me Sainted Ma would think about X, Y, or Z. Then we have question number 8, Quark, your not-so-friendly bartender. Another variation on the Starfleet-only show model is that the bar on Deep Space Nine is run by a Ferengi named Quark, who is sharp and conniving and has all the greatest lines. They got one of the best character actors to play him and played it to the hilt. Quark is amazing in Deep Space Nine. You'd think that he's just going to be a kind of weaselly comic effect, but he ends up being much more than that, and it happens almost immediately. That whatever original idea the showrunners might have had to make him comic relief goes out the window right away. He starts to become much more complex. What was the question that I came up with? This is about alcohol? No, are you consumed with greed? The Ferengi are consumed with greed. They are an entirely financial species. Are you consumed with greed? Do you manage money well? What kind of role does it play in your life? Here, of course, money plays a supreme role in all our lives. It makes your life possible. But I don't manage it well at all, and it largely mystifies me. It largely does. It's not a question of nefarious, of anything nefarious. It's that I've just never understood it. I find it very difficult to keep and very easy to give away. So that's not a good combination. But I'm curious to know about you. Do you have a huge nest egg? Do you manage your money? Do you budget everything? Are you conscious of money no matter what you're doing, no matter what the occasion? Very curious to know. And then question number 9 to finish up, since the landscapers obviously aren't going to finish up anytime soon. Gul Dukat. Here I am not talking about a member of Starfleet, and I am not talking about a denizen of Deep Space Nine, like all the other characters. Gul Dukat is the enemy. He is a Cardassian commander who once commanded Terok Nor. Benjamin Sisko, when he sits in the commander's office on Deep Space Nine, is sitting in Gul Dukat's own office. And the Cardassians, of course, always dream of getting Deep Space Nine back. They want it back. So I referred to him as the honorable enemy, although fans of Deep Space Nine are going to remember one of the last things he does in the show, which is not honorable at all, which breaks your heart. Have you ever worn padded leather, as Gul Dukat does, had a complete mental breakdown, as Gul Dukat does, and thrown around bolts of mystical energy, as Gul Dukat at one point does? And my answer to this question is, as I have mentioned many times before, the 70s were difficult to explain. Anyway, that's your Deep Space Nine tag for BookTrek. Feel free to do this tomorrow for Tag Tuesday or whenever you feel like it, especially if you're a Deep Space Nine fan. I know lots and lots of Star Trek fans. I've met almost no... All Star Trek fans have their favorite show, their favorite version of the show. And I've almost never met someone for whom that favorite show is Deep Space Nine. So if that is true for you when you have a BookTube channel, obviously this tag is calling to you. So I would love to hear your answers. But anyway, I'll be back. And now that I am back, I will be back. I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.